Global policy push for digital IDs as the new form of government-issued identification credentials. And they're essentially all based on your biometric data, which can be your fingerprints, your face, the iris of your eyeball. And the idea is essentially to collect all of that data and have it housed or have it tied directly to your digital ID. So your physical ID will be mapped to the digital ID. These are not really a separate project from CBDCs and this new digital financial system. And UN documentation and also documentation from the Bank of International Settlements, they very overtly state that CBDCs and digital IDs are meant to go together. And without digital IDs, the CBDC digital finance system cannot exist. One of the reasons it can't exist without that is because of the KYC functionality built into this digital financial system. They have the know your customer protocols. They have to know who you are. And so they want to have your wallet tied to a digital ID and have that digital ID be mapped to your physical ID through the biometric data collection. So there's different efforts to make digital IDs either as NFTs, non-fungible tokens. There's also the efforts of Sam Altman of OpenAI and his WorldCoin project, whereby you scan your iris, you give them the biometric credentials of your eyeball. They give you a unique identifier, a digital ID, and it's inherently tied to a digital wallet. That is the same model the UN is using. They've already implemented it for refugees getting food assistance from the World Food Program. It's called Building Blocks. It's on blockchain. It involves refugees scanning their irises, and in order to buy food or receive their rations, they have to check out of a grocery store style place in the refugee camp, and they check out biometrically with an eyeball scan. And then the amount of food they have, the monetary value of that is subtracted from their digital wallet connected to their digital ID and their iris. It doesn't matter what country you're in or whether you're part of BRICS or part of the collective West. This is being rolled out across the board.
So what entities are pushing this interoperability?
One of the main reasons for this coordinated global push to develop digital IDs is because it's deemed essential to the entire Sustainable Development Agenda, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, also known as Agenda 2030. And the specific part dealing with digital IDs is within SDG 16, which is about building peaceful and inclusive societies. One of the indicators of SDG 16, 16.9, calls for legal identification for everyone in the world from the time they're born, essentially. The leading alliance that was launched under the auspices of the UN to accomplish that is known as ID 2020 and has since been folded into what is called the Digital Impact Alliance, which essentially has the same funders and founders as ID 2020. So ID 2020, the UN and other stakeholders in this particular sphere often argue that the reason this is necessary is because of what they call the identity gap. And the identity gap is the claim that the lack of digital ID is preventing people, mainly the world's poor, from accessing essential services, whether it's banking, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare. They claim the only way for these people to be able to access these services is to onboard them to these identity schemes. By essential services is, they say without these forms of recognized identity, people in the world, mainly the world's poor, are unable to access bank accounts, unable to access healthcare, unable to access government services, a variety of things, because they don't have ID or they don't have bank accounts. Things of that nature. So in order to allow everyone to access all of these things and include them, hence the frequent word of inclusion in all these documents, they say digital ID is the necessary way to bridge this identity gap.
Do you find those arguments credible, or?
One of the main words they use to market this stuff is equity and inclusion. The idea that we need to include everybody in these new systems. But if you don't participate in digital ID, you won't have a legally recognized identity, you won't have rights, you won't be able to access services without it. So it's being framed as promoting inclusion, but the system itself is inherently exclusionary and has been used to track and surveil people, to link people to, essentially all their activities, what they say online in some of the countries that have rolled this out, and has been used to facilitate human rights abuses. So it's not exactly as inclusive as they like to claim. It's inclusive in the sense that we want everyone equally included in our new system that we're creating, our new control system, fundamentally. The UN likes to talk about human rights and how this is ultimately a human rights project and things like that, or how it's empowering human rights. But in other documents of the UN, they refer to human rights not as inalienable rights, which is what most people think of when they hear the term human rights. In some of these UN documents, they refer to human rights explicitly as policy tools, or tools that can be used to basically implement, specific things and mechanisms that ultimately give, greater control over really any aspect of your life that they may want to influence. These guys also admit that the digital ID and CBDC is meant to be the same thing, and there's some very illuminating policy documents in this regard. So, for example, there's this one UN document called the People's Money, they call it, and it essentially talks about creating a citizen-centric, SDG-aligned digital financial system, which is obviously the system that we've been talking about. And what they say in there is essentially once your savings and your money is onboarded onto the system, they feel that they reserve the right to access and use your funds to develop and implement the Sustainable Development Goals.
And so I found this document after going through the United Nations website. It is indeed called The People's Money, and this is publicly available for all of you guys to look at yourself. But I found a few things in this document extremely interesting. There's roughly 60 pages. The introduction alone is about 5 pages, but they make a lot of interesting statements, right? And this is from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and these people are super connected. I mean, we have people from every single 3-letter agency that exists making quotes and talking about this whole idea of the people's money. Now, one thing that I found really interesting throughout this document is the theme of urgency. They say there is an urgent need to return the financial services industry to what it's supposed to be, an industry that serves people. But what they don't seem to like to talk about is how this new system actually gives them a lot more control. It is a classic manipulation tactic. They're saying, this is for you guys. This is in your best interest. You guys need to want this. This is going to make sure that you guys are not going to be taken advantage of. Meanwhile, we are giving all of the power to these very few individuals who have been abusing us for all of this time. I mean, do we really trust BlackRock? They are a member who is frequently attending these meetings. Do we think that BlackRock is going to solve our problems? Do we want to give them more power over what we're doing? But their messaging across this is, oh, this is a historic opportunity combined with unprecedented crises that we're going to solve. And it's just so concerning that they're releasing these documents and talking about this, and people are just shaking their head and saying, yeah, this sounds like a fantastic thing. So Whitney Webb is 100% correct. And I urge you guys to take out and read this document yourself. I will provide a link to this, but first, there's much more important information that Whitney Webb does talk about here. We're really just getting started.
Feel that they reserve the right to access and use your funds to develop and implement the Sustainable Development Goals, or build the infrastructure necessary for it. So they essentially think that your money is their money. When COVID was happening, there was this push for vaccine passports, and a lot of the people that were pushing or creating the vaccine passports were part of this either ID 2020, or they were part of related entities pushing for digital ID. And essentially what happened with the vaccine passport was to link your identity to your travel, to the freedom of movement. And if you didn't have one, you were excluded from entering certain places. So that, again, highlights the idea of how these digital IDs are inherently exclusionary, because if you don't have one, then you're excluded from, moving where other people that have those privileges. And if you don't abide by these various stipulations, you're excluded from participating in those things. And if you look at how the UN sponsored groups like ID 2020 are constructing this, they're trying to hide behind a facade of decentralization and construct digital identity in a way that they call as vendor agnostic, meaning that any private company in theory could develop a digital ID system that people could use. So you'll have a variety of companies or government agencies issuing digital ID, and it will not look like a centralized digital ID, but it will be. Based on what's been developed so far by these entities, it seems like that database is meant to be housed at the World Bank, and it's called ID4D, and is sort of cloaked in the same rhetoric that ID 2020, cloaks their own project, claiming it's decentralized and all of this, but it's a centralized global data set where all these different digital ID systems can export their data to. The World Bank's interesting in the sense that, the World Bank, the IMF, they essentially use a debt slavery model to enforce policy objectives on national governments. And the World Bank has openly said that debt is a critical form of financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. So basically saddle a country in debt, and instead of having it enact austerity policies and things like that, it's to get them to enact digital ID. It's to get them to enact, financial inclusion, as they call it, with the CBDCs and their public-private sector equivalents, things of that nature. So that's how they force nation states to act as these enabling environments for these policies. A lot of it is through debt slavery, essentially.
And then governments are sort of just voluntarily following all that.
The UN very openly views the role of national governments only as enabling environments for these policies. So the national governments aren't meant to develop these policies themselves. They're meant to enforce these policies developed by the UN and their stakeholder partners, groups like the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then enforce those policies on the public. So a lot of people view the UN sort of as a meeting of the different public sectors and governments of the world, but even the UN leadership have admitted that since at least in the 1990s, if not earlier, there was what Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, called a quiet revolution at the UN, where the business of the UN became the businesses of the world. And there was this move away from the public sector to having it emphasize public-private partnership, which is why you have the premier promoter globally of public-private partnerships, the World Economic Forum, being one of the main strategic partners currently of the United Nations. And this isn't free market capitalism, it's crony capitalism, it's cartelism, because these are, fundamentally corrupt players that don't play by the rules. They manipulate the free market to advance themselves and generate more money and become more powerful. And so really this is, a merging of the public and the private sector, but it's the private ones in control, and they operate as a cartel, not as free market capitalists. And that's essentially where we are right now. And this was essentially admitted before Congress by a very prominent figure at the time named Samuel Pisar, who is probably best known now as being the stepfather of current Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. And when he testified before Congress, he talked about the rise of what he called the trans-ideological corporation, where essentially Western capitalists, or a group of them, had decided to cooperate and do business rather with the people that ran state-owned enterprises in the communist bloc, and together build a network of corporations, essentially, that would become so powerful that they would make the nation state irrelevant. And this is essentially the model we have today.
These policies would include like the CBDCs, the SDGs, and the digital IDs? Or?
Yeah, so a lot of these policies are folded into the UN Sustainable Development Agenda or the Digital ID Agenda, and there's different think tanks and different entities that push for these things, but one of the overarching ways this is being forced on the national governments is the Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs, which essentially every country in the world has signed on to implement, and even countries that are supposedly against, the West, for example, the adversaries of the West, like Russia and China, have issued joint statements about how they agree about Agenda 2030 and the need to implement these things, while the West, the EU, the Biden administration all also agree about those things. It's a global agreement that these particular policies need to be implemented at the global level. I think there's a lot of growing awareness that the UN as the global superpower is problematic for a variety of reasons. But the same people that ensured the creation of the US as this superpower in the post-World War II era are also behind the creation of this multipolar world order that is also being, currently created right now. So after World War II, there was the Bretton Woods situation, which helped ensure U.S. financial hegemony around the world. And currently, we have what a lot of these same actors are calling the new Bretton Woods moment that needs to be seized in order to create a new global financial governance system. And they inherently frame that new system as being multipolar in nature.
And so what I personally believe to be the most concerning part of this whole issue is that both the central bank digital currencies and this digital ID that the UN and the WEF and the IMF are all working together on, they're framing it as something that is decentralized when in reality it is completely centralized, and it gives them complete authoritarian control over your life. And this is something that most people are not even aware is currently happening right now. In fact, 99% of the world population doesn't even know that these organizations exist. They don't even know that these experiments are currently ongoing. And that is why we need to make sure that everybody does see this. So if this video resonated with you, if it taught you something new, please consider subscribing to my channel. I make crypto content and I upload it daily. And I also make tons of interesting videos like this Whitney Webb one here. And please also hit that like button so that this video gets pushed through the YouTube algorithm. And I'll see you guys very soon. Peace out.